In Kingdom Come Deliverance II, one of the most interesting characters you come across is a rebellious outlaw captain by the name of Jan. And as the story unfolds, it soon becomes clear that this is none other than the Czech national hero, Jan Zizka. And let me tell you, Jan Zizka wasn't just any old medieval warlord. This guy never lost a battle, an accomplishment which is all the more impressive when you consider he led a horde of untrained peasants and religious fanatics against battle-hardened professional knights and soldiers from some of the most powerful military forces in Europe. Many say he's one of only 7 undefeated generals in history. And not just by luck, the man was extremely cunning and had an uncanny ability to turn peasants into warriors. Jan Zizka was born around the year 1360 in the village of Trocnov in modern-day Czech Republic, near the town of Budweis. And yes, that is the place that gave the world Budweiser. And Jan Zizka wasn't from some lowly peasant family, but he wasn't living the high life either. His family were minor gentry, meaning they had a coat of arms with a crayfish, oddly enough, on it, but not a ton of wealth. He had a brother named Jaroslav, a sister named Aniška, and would have 2 wives throughout his life, both named Catherine. We don't know much about his early years, and a lot of what we do know is pure speculation. By his late teens, it's said that he was already handling his family affairs, but by 1406 there are some records that accuse him of being an outlaw. And some say he may have lost his land and resorted to banditry, robbing travelers on the road. But here's where things get interesting. Despite supposedly being an outlaw, he was captured and would later be pardoned by the king. But why? Why would they pardon this outlaw? That's a mystery. But it suggests that he was valuable in some kind of way. At some point, he worked as a mercenary and even attached himself to the royal court of King Wenceslaus IV. His most notable battle experience came in 1410 at the Battle of Grunwald, where he fought for Poland and Lithuania against the Teutonic Order. This was one of the biggest battles in European history, and it effectively broke the Teutonic Order as a power. And it was here that Žižka would learn the ins and outs of knightly warfare, knowledge he would use later to obliterate his foes on the battlefield. To truly understand the story of Jan Zizka, we need to talk about another, less murderous Jan. Jan Hus was a Czech priest who dared to denounce and challenge the Catholic Church, preaching against them and their corruption of selling indulgences to the rich. He started kind of a movement. Some people say this was the original Protestant Reformation. And at the time, a lot of people had lost their faith in the church. Many people were living poor and miserable lives. So it wasn't just about religion, but it was about enacting societal change, making things fairer and more egalitarian. And this became a very attractive movement for many peasants and disenfranchised people. And Jan Hus gained many followers, and his followers soon became known as the Hussites. And the Hussites themselves were a complex group. They had many factions within them. Some were much more radical. And one of the more radical factions of the Hussites were called the Taborites. They abolished private property, they erased debt, and they rejected the social hierarchies of the past. And in 1420, they founded the city of Tabor, where everything was shared. And if you wanted to join them, you had to give away all of your possessions. And many poor people naturally flocked to this new society, but even craftsmen, priests, and town councillors also joined as well. And not everyone fully agreed with the radical restructuring of society, but they were all united in their desire for a more just and fair world. And to the church and nobility, this wasn't just heresy, this was a threat to their rule and a full-scale revolution. And being the Catholic Church in the 15th century, they didn't take too kindly to this movement, and they responded by burning Jan Hus at the stake. But this didn't stop the movement, it actually fueled the fire even more. And by 1419, the tensions reached a breaking point. They were furious at the corruption of the church and the monarchy, and a Hussite mob stormed into Prague's town hall and threw the city councillors out of a window. And this event is gloriously named the first defenestration of Prague. And this was the official start of the Hussite Wars. And yes, there was a second defenestration of Prague later. Bohemians just had a thing for throwing people out of windows. And when King Wenceslaus IV got word of what happened to his officials, he had a stroke and died. And since he had no children, no heir, the control of Bohemia passed to his brother, the Holy Roman Emperor, King Sigismund, who was promptly ordered by the Pope to launch a crusade against these heretics. The war had begun. The Hussites needed a leader, and this is where Jan Zizka comes in. So the year 1420 is when Jan Zizka's story really begins, and at this point he's already 60 years old. And by this time, he had already lost one of his eyes, which is why most depictions of him show him with an eye patch. Sigismund was eager to stamp out this rebellion and launched an invasion of Bohemia. Jan Zizka was out in the countryside recruiting new troops when suddenly there was an ambush, and they suddenly found themselves surrounded near the village of Sudomer by an enemy of 2,000 Crusader knights. Žižka was with a group of 400 Hussites. Not all of them were soldiers, some of them were peasants and women. He quickly took his group to an advantageous position. He used his transport wagons to create a makeshift fort in a swamp, forcing the knights into a muddy, uneven battlefield where their cavalry became useless. The knights charged at the wagons, expecting to massacre these peasants, but the horses couldn't get through the marshy swamp, and their armor weighed them down, so they were forced to dismount into knee-deep mud. And that's when the gunfire started. The Hussite gunmen and crossbows opened fire from the wagons, cutting down the knights before they even got close. And the ones that did make it through were met with the peasants' flails and other farming implements that were used to smash through the knights' armor. By nightfall, thousands of crusaders lay dead, and a fog rolled in, and Žižka used it as cover to withdraw his forces, not just surviving, but outright winning the battle. This was an important moment because a small group of untrained peasants using farming tools and early gunpowder weapons were able to defeat a force of elite knights. Jan Zizka had rewritten the rules of medieval warfare. More and more peasants flocked to his banner, eager to join his army of farmers turned soldiers. After the Battle of Sudomer, Jan Zizka began to use his war wagons more and more. This was the closest thing that the medieval world had to a battle tank. They were rolling fortresses built from heavy timber, reinforced with iron, and tough enough to shrug off bullets, arrows, and crossbow bolts. And Žižka packed these wagons full of peasants, armed to the teeth with cannons, crossbows, the Czech pistolas, and anything else that could shoot or smash. In battle, they became mobile gun platforms, pouring fire into enemy ranks while keeping their crews safe behind the armored walls. If knights were to charge them, they were forced into these narrow gaps between the wagons, making them easy targets. And he also pioneered these small cannons called the hufnici to pound the enemies from long range. And that's where the word howitzer comes from. These were the very first howitzer artillery cannons. And if the enemy tried to flee, Jan Zizka would always keep horsemen behind the wagons to sweep in and finish the job. And these wagons weren't just weapons, they were also used as mobile command centers, supply trucks, and even workshops where the Hussite soldiers would forge weapons, make bullets, and repair their armor on the go. Then on June 12, 1420, after his stunning victory at Sudomer, the Hussite movement was no longer just a fringe rebellion. It was a full-blown revolution. More and more people took up arms, and the city of Prague became the beating heart of their uprising. And King Sigismund of Hungary wasn't about to let a bunch of heretic peasants take control of the most important city in Bohemia. He marched a massive army of crusading knights and mercenaries right to the gates of Prague. His mission was to burn the city, crush the Hussites, and end this rebellion for good. But the siege dragged on. The Hussites were outnumbered, but they wouldn't break. So Sigismund grew impatient, and if he couldn't take Prague by force, he would starve the city into submission. So he planned to capture Vitkov Hill. Overlooking the city, it controlled access to supplies, reinforcements, and if Sigismund took it, he could choke Prague into surrender. So he sent a large force of his knights to take the hill, believing it would be an easy victory. But Žižka was there waiting for him. With only a tiny force of defenders, he fortified the hill with his battle wagons. And the Hussites weren't just fighting to hold the high ground, they were fighting for the survival of their movement. Some of Sigismund's knights made it to the top, exhausted, only to be cut down in brutal hand-to-hand combat by the Hussite peasants wielding their flails and axes. And then a Hussite relief force ambushed the Crusaders from behind, trapping them. Many fled while others were slaughtered where they stood. And Vitkov Hill belonged to the Hussites. Sigismund had failed, pulled his forces back, and Prague remained in Hussite control. And this battle changed everything because the Hussites weren't just fighting for survival, now they were actually winning. After driving Sigismund's forces out of Bohemia itself, Jan Zizka stuck to his principles. He never claimed land or titles for himself, and this was something very rare for warlords of the time. But in 1421, during the siege of Rabi, he suffered an injury and lost his last good eye, leaving him completely blind. And most people would have stepped down, but Žižka kept fighting. His mind was so sharp and attuned to being a military commander, he didn't actually need to see the battlefield to give orders to his men and defeat his opponents. And after that, Jan Zizka would even lead an army outside of Bohemia into Hungary to take the fight to Sigismund's lands. But this campaign didn't go so well. They didn't have the home advantage anymore. But Jan Zizka was very cautious and didn't engage with the Hungarian army, so technically he didn't lose. He just pulled his troops out and went back home to Bohemia because he didn't want to take the risk and lose his army. And in 1424, Bohemia was again torn apart by infighting. And Jan Zizka was determined to unite the Hussites and marched on Prague not to conquer it but to end this civil war. And to lead by example, he rallied his troops for one final campaign against Sigismund's supporters in Moravia. But Žižka would never make it to Moravia. Instead of dying in battle, leading his men to another victory, he would fall victim to the plague, some say the Black Death, on October 11th, 1424. And his death hit his troops extremely hard. They had followed him for years. They were extremely loyal. They believed he was invincible. And without him, his troops felt so lost that they called themselves the Orphans. But they still continued to fight in his name. There's one legend, which is pretty gross, that says on his deathbed, his last dying wish was for his skin to be made into war drums so that he could continue to lead his men even after he was dead. But whether or not this actually happened is unknown. And the Hussite wars would drag on for another 10 years. But in the end, Žižka's faction, the Taborites, would lose. The more moderate Utraquists made a deal with the Catholics, and Hussitism was banned, and Sigismund finally became the king of Bohemia. But even though he fought on the losing side, Jan Zizka is still remembered as one of the greatest military commanders in history. And today he remains a Czech national hero. If you visit Prague, you'll see his massive statue atop of Vitkov Hill, where he once defended the city. And Žižka's story is one of relentless determination. He never lost a battle, he fought blind, and even in death, his name lived on. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.